Hello everyone. Welcome to the Trans Healthcare Now demonstration. My name is Nick, my pronouns are he, him, and I will be moderating this demonstration and also reading the opening speech in English. We also have the Dutch version coming afterwards. For those of you who do not know, Zorg Nu is a countrywide movement that started with the first demonstration in Amsterdam and continues in cities all around the Netherlands. We are here today to bring public attention to the inaccessibility and inefficiency of trans healthcare and to demand change from hospitals as well as from the Dutch Ministry of Health. Medical transition, meaning hormonal therapy and gender-affirming surgeries, are extremely difficult to access by trans people. The waiting list to gender team at the UMCG, which is the only local provider of trans healthcare, is anywhere between 9 months to 1 year. These waiting lists are only getting longer. This is a long time to wait for potentially life-saving treatment. Not everyone makes it to the end of the waiting period. The process of working with the gender team or any other trans healthcare provider is created against trans people. At the moment, the gender team acts as a gatekeeper of medical transition. An overwhelming majority of healthcare providers trans people work with are not trans themselves and, therefore, cannot fully understand the lived experience of trans people. They get to decide whether or not our suffering is great enough to grant us access to treatment. They demand to know our story and our pain in great detail, to diagnose us with gender dysphoria. We are assessed on how cisnormative we are, how much our choices for our own bodies match their ideas of what we should and should not want from our transition. For many of us, this process is humiliating and traumatizing. Medical transition in the Netherlands also requires trans people to undergo the real life phase. This is usually a year during which a trans person is expected to come out and present in accordance with their gender identity in their everyday life. This is before we get to access any treatment or change our documents. The real life phase makes trans people extremely vulnerable to discrimination and violence. Acts of aggression against trans people, and especially trans women and trans feminine people, have been on the rise for years now. Nobody should be forced to put themselves in danger to access medical help. We deserve better. We deserve to make our own decisions about our own bodies and lives. We deserve safe and dignified access to medical transition. We deserve empathy and support. Our community lost countless beautiful souls to these cruel medical practices. Today, we demand change. Here are the demands of our movement, taken from the Zorg Nu statement. 1. No waiting lists. The waiting lists of the gender teams of 2 to 3 years force transgender people to put on hold important part of their lives and cause unacceptable suffering. By decentralizing transgender care and making it accessible without diagnosis, the waiting lists can be made a thing of the past once and for all. 2. No diagnosis. Complete self-determination. Being trans cannot be diagnosed. The diagnosis is nothing more than gatekeeping. Cisgender doctors decide who is trans enough and how that person gets to express it. The process of diagnosis gives doctors power over trans people and enables the malpractices in trans healthcare. This has to stop. Transgender people need to have complete self-determination and access to all forms of transition care without diagnosis. We want the control over our own care and our own bodies. 3. Decentralized trans care. Break the monopoly. In order to realize sufficient, good and accessible care, transition care has to be divorced from the gender teams. Most transition care is not specialist work and can be provided fast, locally and safely by general practitioners. GPs are already qualified to prescribe hormonal treatment and could do so even more expertly with a short training and access to advice from an endocrinologist in the case of complications. Treatments such as speech therapy and laser are already available locally. The only thing that's necessary is reimbursement by health insurance for trans people who look for this care without a referral from a gender team. Hospitals, finally, should concentrate on rapidly expanding surgery capacity and opening it up to all trans people in need of this care, regardless of whether they've been to a gender team. 4. Transgender care in transgender hands. Transgender patients must be able to find care providers who understand their experience. Transgender students and care providers who want to focus on transition care must be provided the means to do so. Transgender people who have already become experts in area of transition care must be able to get the right qualification to provide it in an accelerated way. Trans people who have been obliged to take their own care into their own hands should immediately and unconditionally get access to safe medication and blood testing. Information on medication and hormone values must be accessible to everyone. We will no longer tolerate humiliating conversations with psychiatrists in order to prove that we are trans enough. We will no longer wait for years in order to access essential care. We demand an end to the power of the gender teams and realization of fast, local care based on bodily autonomy. Thank you. I would like to now welcome Nana, who is going to give the Dutch version of our opening speech.
Hallo iedereen, goedemiddag. Ik ben Nana en mijn pronouns zijn zij, haar en dien, diens. En ik ga nu de vertaling van de opening speech voor jullie lezen. Dit is gemaakt door Colin. Hallo allemaal, welkom bij de Zorg Nu demonstratie. Voor degenen van jullie die het nog niet weten, Zorg Nu is een landelijke beweging die begon met de eerste demonstratie in Amsterdam en in steden overal door Nederland voortzet. We zijn hier vandaag om aandacht te vragen voor de ontoegankelijkheid en inefficiëntie van de transgenderzorg en om verandering te eisen van ziekenhuizen, vooral van het UMCG en ook van het Nederlandse ministerie van Volksgezondheid. Medische transitie, wat inhoudt hormoontherapie en genderbevestigende operaties, zijn extreem moeilijk te verkrijgen voor trans mensen. De wachtlijst van het genderteam bij het UMCG, wat de enige lokale aanbieder van transgenderzorg is, ligt tussen 9 maanden tot een jaar. Deze wachtlijsten worden alleen maar langer. Dit is een lange tijd om te wachten op mogelijke levensreddende behandelingen. Niet iedereen haalt het einde van de wachtperiode. Het proces van werken met een genderteam of een andere transgender zorgverlener werkt tegen trans mensen. Op dit moment vervult het genderteam een poortwachtersfunctie bij het krijgen van toegang tot medische transitie. De meeste zorgverleners die nu werken met trans mensen zijn niet zelf trans en kunnen daarom de geleefde ervaringen van trans mensen niet volledig begrijpen. Zij bepalen of ons lijden groot genoeg is om ons toegang te geven tot behandelingen. Ze eisen ons verhaal en onze pijn in detail te horen te krijgen om ons met genderdysforie te diagnosticeren. We worden beoordeeld op hoe cisnormatief we zijn. Hoeveel de keuzes voor ons lichaam overeenkomen met hun idee van wat wij wel en niet zouden moeten willen van onze transitie. Voor veel van ons is dit proces vernederend en traumatiserend. Medische transitie in Nederland vereist ook van trans mensen dat ze de echte levensfase ondergaan. Dit is meestal een jaar waarin een transpersoon verwacht wordt uit de kast te komen en zich in overeenkomst met hun met hun genderidentiteit te presenteren in het dagelijkse leven. Dit is voor we toegang krijgen tot enige behandelingen of onze documenten kunnen veranderen. Deze fase maakt transpersonen extreem kwetsbaar voor discriminatie en geweld. Daden van agressie tegen transmensen en vooral tegen transvrouwen en transfeminine mensen komen de afgelopen jaren steeds vaker voor. Niemand zal gedwongen moeten worden zichzelf in gevaar te brengen om toegang te krijgen tot medische hulp. We verdienen beter. We verdienen het om onze eigen beslissingen te nemen over onze eigen lichamen en levens. We verdienen veilige en waardige toegang tot medische transitie. We verdienen empathie en steun. Onze gemeenschap heeft ontelbare zielen verloren aan deze wrede medische praktijken. Vandaag eisen we verandering. Dit zijn de eisen van onze beweging, genomen van een Zorg Nu statement. Nummer 1. Geen wachtlijsten. De wachtlijsten van de genderteams van 2 tot soms bijna 3 jaar dwingen transgender mensen om een belangrijk deel van hun leven op pauze te zetten en veroorzaken onacceptabel lijden. Door transitiezorg te decentraliseren en toegankelijk te maken zonder diagnose kunnen de wachtlijsten voor eens en altijd verleden tijd worden. Nummer 2. Geen diagnose. Volledige zelfbeschikking. Transgender zijn kan niet gediagnosticeerd worden. De diagnose is niet anders dan gatekeeping. Ze schenden artsen die bepalen wie er trans genoeg is en hoe die persoon dat mag uiten. Het diagnoseproces geeft artsen macht over trans mensen en maakt de grote misstanden in de transgenderzorg mogelijk. Dit moet stoppen. Transgender mensen moeten volledige zelfbeschikking krijgen en toegang tot alle vormen van transitiezorg zonder diagnose. Wij willen de regie over onze eigen zorg en ons eigen lichaam. Nummer 3. Decentraliseer de transgenderzorg. Doorbreek het monopolie. Om echt voldoende, goede en toegankelijke zorg te realiseren, moet de transitiezorg losgetrokken worden van de genderteams. De meeste transitiezorg is geen specialistisch werk en kan snel, lokaal en veilig beschikbaar worden gesteld via de huisarts. De huisarts is al bevoegd om hormoonbehandelingen voor te schrijven en zal dit nog beter kunnen doen met een korte bijscholing en toegang tot advies van een endocrinoloog bij complicaties. Zaken zoals logopedie en laserbehandelingen zijn lokaal beschikbaar. Er is alleen vergoeding van de zorgverzekeraar nodig voor trans mensen die deze zorg zoeken, zonder een doorverwijzing van het genderteam. Ziekenhuizen tenslotte moeten zich concentreren op het sterk uitbreiden van de operatiecapaciteit en dit openstellen voor alle transgender mensen die deze zorg nodig hebben, ongeacht of zij bij een genderteam zijn geweest. En eindelijk nummer 4, transgenderzorg in transgender handen. Transgender patiënten moeten terecht kunnen bij zorgverleners die weten wat ze meemaken. Transgender studenten en zorgverleners die zich willen richten op transitiezorg moeten hier de middelen voor krijgen. Transgender mensen die zelf al expertise hebben ontwikkeld op het gebied van transitiezorg moeten versnel een bevoegdheid kunnen halen om deze zorg aan te kunnen bieden. Transgender mensen die hun eigen zorg noodzakelijkerwijs in eigen hand hebben genomen, moeten per direct en onvoorwaardelijk toegang krijgen tot veilige medicatie en bloedtesten. Informatie over medicatie en bloedwaardes moet voor iedereen toegankelijk zijn. Wij zijn niet langer bereid vernederende gesprekken met psychiaters te voeren om te bewijzen dat we trans genoeg zijn. Wij zijn niet langer bereid jaren te wachten op noodzakelijke zorg. Wij eisen een einde aan de macht van de genderteams en realisatie van snelle lokale zorg op basis van eigen regie over eigen lichaam.
We are now going to hold a minute of silence in honor of everyone we have lost to mistreatment of trans people in healthcare. Thank you, everyone. Now, please welcome to the stage Millie. Millie is a black trans human rights activist from Trinidad and Tobago. She is also a singer, dancer, writer, vlogger, and a podcaster.
Hello, everybody. Oh, it's a little bit short for me. Could you help me? A little bit higher. Oh, a little bit too high here. Hello, everybody. My name is Millie, and I am so proud to be here today to stand with and for my trans siblings here in Groningen and also in the Netherlands, and by extension, trans people all over the world. Where I come from, the so-called third world, whatever that might mean, I was privileged to start my medical transition even without there being specific medical specialism or rights for transgender people in my country. Looking back, I think I found a way without a way, partly because I was determined to physically become the woman I knew I was on the inside, but also because I fitted well enough into the boxes of what society decided was acceptable for me to be as a trans woman, to be accepted into the club of womanhood, which meant that I had to aspire to become or mimic what society saw as a real woman in the way I behaved and presented. 8 years ago, I moved to the Netherlands as an asylum seeker. And as a transgender asylum seeker, medical care was not afforded to you until it was decided if you could stay in the Netherlands or not. And still after that, you had to wait to join a clinic because, like Nick pointed out before, the waiting lists are really long. So after that, you would still have to wait to start your transition. But luckily, I had hormones and a prescription from my doctor in Trinidad, which supported a claim to hormone therapy, while I was waiting, sorry. Even though I had not officially started my transition in a clinic in the Netherlands yet, I also think that already having started my transition in my country fitted well enough into the binary of what a woman means in the Western sense. And my desire to have surgery, which was then also a requirement to get your sex changed legally. My transness basically aligned well to the requirements of the binary system of care set up not by trans people but by cisgender heteronormative people. I say cisgender heteronormative, meaning most of the doctors in the healthcare system, if not all, who serve the trans community are cisgender people. Therefore, the way they would view transness is from their own lens, which is a cis heteronormative lens. These factors, I believe, made my entry into the healthcare system for trans people relatively smooth. The same courtesies was not afforded to my Georgian roommate, who was also trans. This had to do with the fact that she did not yet have permission to stay in the Netherlands. This to me is an infringement on human rights because trans care is a life-saving, necessary type of healthcare that should be available to all trans people everywhere. But this is not the case. The fact that some are afforded care while others are not is a whole other conversation within this conversation about trans care that needs to be had. For years, I thought of gender and transgenderness as being binary. This was because as a transgender person, I grew up in a heteronormative world. I was taught straight people were the norm and to be heteronormative was the only way of being, and anything else was bad or didn't belong or shouldn't exist. This way of seeing gender determined how I saw my gender and the genders of others until I moved to Groningen and started attending the university. Being a part of the faculty of arts taught me to be open to diversity and humanity, and also meeting many queer people and activists who championed and acknowledged other ways of being. This changed the way I thought about gender. I went from thinking of gender as a fixed binary to realizing it was much more. I learned that gender was something that shifted and evolved as we go along our lives. As a result of this, the way I started to see my transness and my womanhood also changed. Even though I still feel like my gender identity aligns with a binary way of being, I realized that the definition of my womanhood was constantly changing. This is to say that gender is unique to us and we have the ability to choose what our gender looks like, and we should be able to do this without fear. This is why I think gender and the way in which healthcare professionals treat with transgender patients needs to change. Transgender healthcare needs to center trans people and the way they see themselves and their transness as paramount. It should not be centered around heteronormative ways of being or controlled by heteronormativity. Transgender care should be a guide for trans persons to decide who they are in this world. The idea that differences can't exist together peacefully and respectfully in society is an outdated way of thinking that needs to change. I mean, I am black and I am here existing with white people. In the same way, queer people are here and they're existing with straight people. And I think we all belong here. We need to start thinking of gender in a diverse way and realizing that one way of being may work for some, but may not work for others, and not to force our ways of being on others. Lastly, I would just like to shout out my non-binary siblings because I think they're really pushing the envelope where it comes to diversity and also showing this world that there's so much choices, in the world, and also that diversity is the way ahead. So, thank you. Before I go, I just want to also sing a song. And this is, I know it's been a hard time with COVID and everything, and I think it especially impacts trans people. So lately I've been listening to a lot of Stevie Wonder, and there's this song I really love of him. It's called There's a Place in the Sun. And I want to sing it for you all to just encourage you and give you hope to keep going on. I kind of just learned it, so I'm going to look at the lyrics on my phone. Like a long, lonely stream, I keep running towards a dream, moving on, like a branch on a tree. I keep reaching for be free, moving on, 'cause there's a place in the sun where there's hope for everyone, where my poor restless heart gotta run. 'Cause there's a place in the sun, and before my life is done, gotta find me a place in the sun. Like an old dusty road, I get weary from the load, moving on, like this tide troubled earth. I've been rolling since my birth, moving on, 'cause there's a place in the sun where there's hope for everyone, where my poor restless heart's gotta run. 'Cause there's a place in the sun, and before my life is done, gotta find me a place in the sun. Thank you.
I am small. Thank you so much, Millie. Now we are going to hear a speech by Alabaster. They are a transgender coach, meaning they support trans people in exploring their gender identity, coming out, and transition. So give it up for Alabaster.
Thank you so much for that. I think I'll just start. I've often wished that I could have been born in a different time, somewhere in the future, where being allowed to transition is as easy as making the decision to do so. A future where we can go to our doctor, ask for the medical help we need, and get it without having to defend ourselves. But sometimes it feels like we're stuck in this world of systems, of doctors and governments and health insurance companies who make decisions over our heads. You are questioned about your past, your family, your youth, questioned about what you feel, asked to write a personal gender history, as if that proves anything. In my time at the UMCG, I at no point felt that the therapist In my time at the UMCG, I at no point felt that the therapist I was talking to knew what she was looking for. She asked one question after another, seemingly from a list she'd memorized. Then she'd make a note and ask her next question without any indication she knew herself why she was asking them. And she could not tell me for how long she would still have to see me. She couldn't tell me what the process was supposed to figure out, except a vague claim of a long-standing wish of transition, without any criteria that I had to meet to prove that to her. This continued for 8 sessions across 8 months. At last, I had an appointment with a psychiatrist, and I knew this was an important event and was immensely nervous beforehand. I expected to be questioned because that's what you come to expect from the UMCG gender team after being subjected to questioning for months, but I had hoped that I would be heard. That hope was squashed less than 5 minutes into the conversation. I was not treated like a fellow human being, but as a daft child. I couldn't possibly know my mind, but the psychiatrist seemed to be able to. At least that's how he spoke to me. I cannot emphasize enough how degrading this experience was for me. There I sat in his office begging him to listen to me, and he would not. The one person who was supposed to help me wouldn't. After the session, the psychiatrist demanded I cooperate in a psychological scan, as it was called. It would consist of endless questionnaires covering the full spectrum of psychological disorders and mental illnesses. The strange thing was, no matter how many questions I asked, no matter how I tried to frame them, no one could explain to me why that was necessary. I told them that I would not be participating if they couldn't tell me why it was needed. And no one was willing, able, or allowed to do so. By then, I had been humiliated enough by the entire process. I decided not to subject myself to something so draining as a full psychological scan if they couldn't tell me why. I had reached my limit. I stood my ground and didn't participate. You might have noticed a theme here in the anecdotes of my experiences at the UMCG. A theme of confusion, of vague information, and unclear protocols. It got me wondering, what is the UMCG looking for when you step in the door? What makes them decide? I asked the people at the UMCG questions about motivations for their protocols, the reasoning behind their method, and it became clear from their answers that there is a glaring issue at the root of the problem of transgender care. Their answers boiled down to this: doctors are not going to perform surgery on healthy bodies for no reason. I've asked questions about what sufficient reason is to transition, but no one could give me a conclusive answer. But reading between the lines, it's quite obvious. only the most excruciatingly gender dysphoric people deserve to transition. Don't mistake it. You have to deserve it. It's horrible, isn't it? Why does horrifying suffering have to be the standard? Why are we only deserving of a complete, fulfilling, happy life if we suffer first? I could have lived with my body as it was for another few decades, I'm sure, but it would have meant decades of suffering, of looking at myself in the mirror and hating what I saw. Could I have borne it? Probably. Would it have been a complete, fulfilling, and happy life? Absolutely not. The standard of the UMCG shouldn't be about suffering. It should be about giving people a fuller life. A life filled with happiness, with contentment, with looking at yourself and being home. The question shouldn't be, does this person suffer enough to warrant transition? The question should be, will transitioning make this person happy? And if the answer is yes to that question, then why deny that person the right to transition? 2 months after my horrible talk with the psychiatrist, I got the green light, as they call it, despite me refusing to cooperate with their methods. I later heard that someone on the surgical team chose my side. They weren't as skeptical of me as the psychiatrist was. And thanks to that person, I'm now much happier. I'm not done transitioning yet, but things have become easier. My days start without dreading the mirror, and I can finally exercise and dance without being reminded that I have a body that doesn't fit me. My life has improved considerably. And sometimes my mind goes to that meeting where it was decided if I was allowed to transition. Who was this person who agreed with me, and how can I thank them? Because if it had been up to the psychiatrist, I have no doubt that I would still be walking around with a body that doesn't fit me. He wanted to see my suffering first. But this person on the surgical team believed me and my story. There is someone at the UMCG willing to look past our suffering and look to our happiness instead. And we need more of these people in the Netherlands. People who will look out for our happiness instead of scrutinizing our suffering. People with compassion who are willing to listen, to learn, and to be taught. And taught by transgender people, I might add. And also we need trans people who are seen as equals and are paid for their efforts. Trans people who are not seen as daft, naive patients. Only then can we really change things. And we need change, for the sake of every transgender person in the Netherlands. Trans liberation now.
Okay, thank you so much, Alabaster. Next up, we are going to hear from Sam. Sam is an active member of GroenLinks, and they are engaged in both local and national politics. They are also very pregnant.
Hi. Small stage. Well, 1.5 years ago, I had these very bad chest pains and I thought I was dying. Apparently, you're not supposed to wear a binder all day, every day. I didn't know, so I talked to my GP about it and he was like, what is a binder? And I had to explain to him that it makes your chest flat. And after explaining how it works, he said, well, that sounds really dangerous. You should never wear a binder again. And I was like, no, dude. That's not how it works. I was experimenting with my gender expression, with my pronouns, and I was using a new name for the first time. And I was so happy with just being me. I had made all these discoveries and I couldn't go back to not wearing a binder. And he, as the white cis man as he was, he went, what are pronouns? And okay, well, I had a little bit more patience back then, so I explained. the whole concept of pronouns to my GP. And he went, okay, so you're not a woman, so you must be a man. And he went with the whole binary speech. And I was like, you are a doctor, man, you're a healthcare professional. This must be an exception to the rule, right? Well, I discovered that it wasn't. Not long after that, I talked with my psychiatrist, and he was like, is gender expression a way for you to start a conversation, to start discussion? It wasn't the exception to the rule, it was the rule. I am now pregnant, 27 weeks, and it's very nice, I'm very thankful for it. But my body is changing in ways that are it's pretty difficult for me. And my doctors are telling me, well, don't worry. All pregnant women have some difficulties with their changing bodies. And pregnant women, that's a sentence they use. It's a word they use every other sentence. It's like, okay, pregnant women, they should eat fish twice a week. Pregnant women, well, they suffer from nausea sometimes. And I'm like, no, I don't belong to that group. How difficult is it for you to just say pregnant people? Thanks. Well, I've been on the waiting list for the UMCG for about 1.5 years now, and I hear it's getting a little bit shorter, which is good, but it's still ridiculously long. But there's so much more to do in our healthcare system. It's much broader than just this. And I think it shouldn't be our task to explain gender to healthcare professionals, and they should really educate themselves. Well, that was all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. Next up is a speech from James, the person who just fixed the mic. James gathered our team to organize Zorg Nu Groningen, and without him this demonstration would not be happening. He is also involved in organizing local Fridays for Future, so James, everyone.
Hi, I'm James, and this is my voice coming up to 3 months on testosterone. Whoa, that's amazing to say. That's really weird to say. Whoa. I remember when I was like 13, 14, and I was just starting to realize I was trans, just starting to like figure it out. And I'd come home almost every day from school, like without fail, and I'd watch like an hour of YouTube videos about transitioning. And I remember at that age just feeling this amazing fascination with it, but also this extremely intense kind of hope. You know, like hope that in the future you can change your body if you don't like it. Hope that eventually you can live as a man, but above all, hope that things genuinely can change for the better. And I think that hope at the time is amazing, and it's captivating, and it's fascinating, but and I think a lot of trans people know this, that hope is a little toxic and it's a little negative. Because the thing about that hope is, it doesn't last forever. When you live in a society that constantly tries to stigmatize you simply for existing, when you wake up every day in a body that you just cannot identify with, when you have a healthcare system that insists in order to access life-saving healthcare, you have to prove your transness to a group of psychiatrists you have never met before who may not have the best interests at heart for you. And the thing about that hope is, It doesn't crash or crumble once when a doctor says no. It's every day. Every day it becomes less and it becomes less and it becomes less. And I know it's sad to talk about. I don't want to talk about it either, but it's kind of the reality. The thing about that hope, though, is... Hold on, I'm a little lost. Sorry. The thing about that hope is that it doesn't last forever. And to fall back on the old cliche of, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel, sometimes when it goes on for so long, you forget that that light is there. And you kind of forget that you're in a tunnel, really. And I think that's when things kind of get their darkest. And I know it's really sad to talk about it. I genuinely don't want to be here talking about it, but the saddest part is some people, they don't make it out of that tunnel. And it's the reality. And it's the reason why days like today are so important. And I'd really like to thank you guys for coming out here today, for being here today, for everyone who has helped organize today, whether it's with the van, whether it's with chalking, whether it's stewarding. Thank you guys so much. You've been amazing. Can you give it like a round of applause for yourself? When I come to these kind of spaces that are like predominantly ran by queer people or have a lot of queer people in them, I always get this intense happiness. And when I come to these spaces, I always take a look around. And I try and remember each face I can see. And I know a couple of you guys are doing the same now because I can kind of see you. And I feel that intense happiness. I feel it right now. But I often feel an intense sadness sometimes too. When I look out, I see so many beautiful smiling faces, and I think about the faces that I don't see. The people who aren't here, whether they're not here by consequences of their own actions or actions someone has put upon them. I think a lot about those people sometimes. I think it's one of the reasons why I wanted to organize today. Because those people should be here. And that's why it's so important that you're here. It's why it's so important that when you're here, you bring the most energy you can feel. Because whatever you're doing, whether it's chants with Maya earlier, you don't just shout for one, you shout for two. You shout for yourself and you shout for the people who aren't here. Because they should be here. And no matter what you're doing, you bring that energy with you. Whether it's organizing, whether it's whatever it is. You bring that energy with you because we cannot afford to lose more people. Hell, we never fucking could. We can no longer accept a 2-year waiting list. We need to fight now for a future that has, for a system and a future where we need no diagnosis, where we have no waiting list, where we have decentralized care, and most of all, a system that puts the well-being of trans people in the hands of trans people. There is no alternative. And we'll do that now, so that in 5-10 years, the people who are here now, there are more. We'll do it now so that in 5-10 years, that 13-year-old, 14-year-old who's figuring themselves out, that 20-year-old who's still figuring things out, that 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old, 102-year-old, so that they can get that healthcare and they don't have to go through that tunnel. And yeah, I'd like to thank you guys so much for being here. most of all, we need action now, so that in 5, 10 years, 2 years, 1 year, someone else can stand on a stage somewhere and say the words, "Hello, my name is James, and this is my voice, 3 months on testosterone." Because I need someone to know how amazing that feels to say. Thank you so much, guys. You've been amazing. Bye.
Thank you so much, James. Our last speaker today is Emmy, and they are giving a speech on behalf of International Socialisten Groningen. So, hello, Emmy.
Hey everyone, it's amazing to see you all here, and the speeches and music till now have been really touching. Thank you everyone who's gone before me, and I'm really honored to be able to give the last speech. I realize we've been listening a lot, so I'll try and keep it kind of short. I'm Emmy, I'm from the International Socialists, I'm queer, I'm non-binary, and I've experienced the awful trans healthcare in the UK. Today I want to talk a little bit about the limits of trans liberation in our capitalist system. It's no secret that the conservative right has been gaining ground across Europe and throughout the world over the past few decades. The impact of right-wing leadership on trans liberation has actually become worse over the past 4 or 5 years. Like in the USA under Trump, trans people were immediately excluded from military service, and the federal protections for LGBT plus people were removed. Hungary has removed the right to change your legal gender full stop, and in Poland they declared LGBT-free zones. In the UK, where I'm from, otherwise known as Turf Island, thanks J.K. Rowling, after a decade of conservative rule, the transphobic gender-critical movement has been rising. Many transphobic groups are now dedicated to rolling back the gains that we've made, such as puberty blockers for trans kids, trans teens. And closer to home, here in the Netherlands, the right-wing FVD party have made it very clear that by resisting the ban on conversion therapy, they stand against queer and trans liberation. In fighting for trans liberation, like we're doing here today, it's important for us to recognize that trans oppression, like the examples that I just mentioned, is structural. It results from the societal relations of capitalism and the capitalist class. Transphobic ideas are not just floating around in the ether, they emerge for particular reasons. And those reasons are explicable within the histories of our societies and the nature of production and reproduction. Fundamentally, transphobia is rooted in class society and more particularly in capitalism. The system's need for clear lines of property relations and for an easily manageable and reproducing workforce has hinged on the gender binary and on the nuclear family. The relations that gave rise to these constructs were exported globally and often forcibly imposed through colonialism and European empires. The rising European colonial system simultaneously designed familial and gender roles to maximize production, while also pillaging communities across the global south for resources, and in effect wiping out what they saw as subversive understandings of gender. We must remember that before class society emerged, not adhering to what we know now as the gender binary was an accepted part of many societies around the world. Binary gender roles, women's oppression, reproductive rights, or rather the lack of them, inheritance laws, and education are also part of this picture of using societal relations to maximize profit and to oppress any resistance. Us trans folks don't fit neatly into this system. Until recently, the capitalist ruling class were prepared to give ground in response to social struggles like for same-sex marriage, because it didn't really affect the growth of the system, and because neoliberal capitalism in the West had advanced past the need for every citizen to be organized in a nuclear family system. But since the crash of 2008 and the ongoing crisis in the system, the capitalist class is increasingly focused on protecting its interests. It uses the transphobia it has engendered to secure its position. In pitting minorities against each other, the capitalist class aims to divide the resistance and unity of the working class. Add neoliberalism to the mix, where society individualizes every aspect of our life, from shelter and food to healthcare and education, and we end up in a stranglehold. The VVD in the Netherlands, which is the ruling party, for example, sees trans healthcare as a personal matter that should only be available to those who can pay for it themselves. This ties to the wider issue of bodily autonomy and self-determination under capitalism, from the accessibility of abortions and reproductive health care to the right to physical integrity and safety at the workplace, accessibility to life-saving medication, the privatization of healthcare, and indeed healthcare for trans folks as well. We come to the same realization. The ruling class always has priority access to necessary care, and those who can't afford it are stripped of the right to manage their own body as they see fit. We cannot expect to achieve trans liberation under capitalism. While we should still fight for trans rights, like we're just doing here today, those rights will never be secure under capitalism. They can always be threatened or rolled back when the system goes into crisis and when authoritarian, right-wing ideas emerge and scapegoat oppressed groups. Simply fighting for reforms, while it's necessary and important, it will never resolve the roots of the oppression. It's easy to get trapped in the fight for representation as well, but we must also recognize its limits. It's all very well appointing a trans politician, but that doesn't guarantee liberation. Caitlyn Jenner, for example, is running as a Republican candidate, while she argues that trans girls shouldn't participate in girls' sports. And in the Netherlands, D66 politician Lise van Ginneken was the first openly elected trans politician, but her party recently prevented the evacuation of 60 Afghan citizens and blocked their right to seek refuge here. So identity-based struggles are a good start, but they remain separated, and they look for individual solutions to structural problems that affect everyone that's divided and oppressed by the capitalist class, be they cis or trans. Instead, let's build a working class movement founded on solidarity that fights for a future in which trans folks and the working class as a whole have self-determination, bodily autonomy, free and quality healthcare, and acceptance in a society in which we are not constrained by a class that oppresses our identities and livelihoods. Let's follow in the footsteps of trans revolutionaries like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and Leslie Feinberg. Let's demand trans liberation, but let's also join forces and commit to fighting in each other's struggles as one movement. After all, we're fighting the same sources of oppression. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I love the spirit. We are trying to make this part of the demonstration free from chance, so that people who do not feel comfortable being around chance have a chance to still join and get the most out of the demonstration. But I love the spirit, and I'm very sorry for having to stop it. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to all our amazing speakers. Thank you to Millie for giving us an amazing performance. Thanks to Maya for leading us in chants at the beginning. Big shout out to our stewards and our volunteers who helped us prepare Grotemarkt and keep the... Yes. Thank you very much, and kept all the participants safe. Thank you to the entire team whose work made this possible. I'm very overwhelmed with emotion, and I knew that it would happen, so I have it written down. But I am speaking from the heart, I promise. Whose work made this demonstration possible. We are only a couple of us could be here today, but this was a group effort, and we are so thankful to everyone who helped make this happen. Thank you to Queer Pride Groningen and the SHOP for giving us financial ability to fund the demonstration and all the expenses associated with it. We we thank Zorg Nu Amsterdam for starting the movement and also for being amazing as we were preparing this demonstration, sharing their resources and spreading the word about our local demonstration. And finally, thank you all for showing up and for joining us in our rage today. So big shout out to you. Some closing words. Our work does not end here. Look out for announcements of actions and projects that will follow this demonstration in the upcoming weeks. This demonstration is just a first step, and there is so many things you can do from here. The best thing you can do after today is to keep fighting. Keep advocating for change. Keep demanding better for yourself and for your trans siblings. Keep creating safe spaces and networks of support for trans people as we are dealing with all the mistreatments you heard about today and more. We deserve better. Thank you. And please, if you can, get to know each other now, create these communities. This is an amazing group of queer, wonderful people that I'm looking at. Please create communities. We need them so much. Take care.